Hello. Well, it's hard to think about anything but existential risk these days. We live in a world where the threat of extinction seems to loom over our heads in all sorts of ways. We're walking a very thin and precarious tightrope. Just a few of the dilemmas we must deal with going forward are a rapidly heating climate, biodiversity loss, global overpopulation, local underpopulation, global pandemics, nuclear weapons proliferation, unregulated AI-generated misinformation, and the possibilities of future threats that are difficult to wrap our heads around, but by no means are merely theoretical thought experiments at this point, such as engineered viruses, unaligned artificial superintelligence, and uncontrollable nanotechnology. So how do you live life and be happy when these omens of doom are everywhere? And yet, let us also realize that we would still live under the shadow of extinction every second of every day, even if all these problems were solved. Because we live under the shadow of our own demise. Because someday we will all die. For no matter how certain some of our global catastrophes, like global heating, seem to be, they are still nowhere near as likely as our own individual deaths. We have a much greater likelihood of averting climate catastrophe and reversing global heating than we do of solving the problem of our own deaths. Barring some extreme innovations by some of the most eccentric Silicon Valley billionaires, a death of some kind seems inevitable for most of us. And if even if our lifespans are artificially lengthened, we live on a planet of finite resources and in a universe of finite resources. Which means that even if we don't die natural deaths, we might very well end up killing each other to use those in the fight over those resources, even if death was quote-unquote solved by some eccentric transhumanist types. Even if we colonize other planets, there's a limited amount of atoms in the universe. So, we will all die someday. It seems inevitable. So why do we not experience these same existential dread towards our own deaths as we do towards these other threat sources? Well, we certainly seem to have to learn this disinterest in our own deaths. When we're kids, we eventually learn that someday we will inevitably die. And we're mortified when that happens as kids. We're shook to our core. It feels like anything we do to find joy or happiness is deluded and irresponsible in the face of certain eternal annihilation. It's remarkable how well we're actually able to train children out of this existential dread, because we don't really have a way of convincing them that they're wrong. We have to admit that they're right. They will all die someday, and so will everyone they love and care about. So what allows us to get over this dread, but not the others? I believe the answer is something that Martin Heidegger first addressed in Being and Time. We all know in a vague way that we will someday die, but we very rarely talk about it in our own terms. We very rarely look at death as something personal. We say everyone will die someday, or death comes to us all, or no one escapes death. But what that really does is it anonymizes death. It decenters us from recognizing death as something that is always ours and ours alone. This is a self-soothing behavior that lessens the burden of the death that we alone face, our own deaths, by making death into something that is shared by everyone. We never own our death or recognize it as something that'll happen to me, myself, and you, your own death. We say death comes to us all, and it seems like we're being honest and looking at death straight on, but in fact we're running away from death and refusing to take it seriously and passing that question off when we speak in such general terms. In fact, many of our great religions seem to be set up primarily to sustain this sort of death denial in increasingly subtle forms, and the most obvious of these are the Christian and Islamic faiths. Really, I would say that these religions have the most childish reception to the fear of death you could imagine. They seem like the equivalent of a child coming up with something to feel comfortable about death. It's fine, I'll die, and then I'll go to paradise and live forever and be always happy with all my friends and family, and maybe if I blow some people up on a bus, I'll get to bang 72 virgins for eternity too. You know, this death denial has such perverse excesses in its fundamentalist forms that motivates atrocities like the Crusades and suicide bombings and genocides and supporting thermonuclear war in the Middle East. The possibility of it, at least. Hopefully not the reality. But make no mistake, most of us partake in this exact same form of evasive behavior, just in a more sophisticated way. A secular version of this may exalt things like the creation of a legacy, where we say that we will die, but we want to spend our life in a way that creates a legacy that will be remembered in a good way. And we'll have children and family that will continue our legacy and do and remember us and gain us some kind of immortality. But in any case, that seems like a little bit of a desire to somehow cheat death and to resist the certainty of annihilation itself. But there was one religious and philosophical system that refused to do this, and it started in India some 2,500 years ago, and was founded by a man named Siddhartha Gautama, or Shakyamuni Buddha. And he told us that demise was constant and inevitable. Even in his part of the world that endorsed the theory of reincarnation, he refused to see that reincarnation as any positive guarantee of continuity. Because even when we reincarnate, he saw that as more of a curse than a blessing. And once you stop trying to expect that continuity and that eternity and make peace with annihilation, you're liberated. Only once you accept the clear and unambiguous end of everything will you be free. And yet, in our daily lives, we might be afraid of this acceptance. We might be afraid that feeling this deep peace and serenity in the face of danger will make us less likely to want to do anything to improve the state of the world. We'll feel that once we make peace with annihilation, we'll just be waiting it out and extremely apathetic when people are making the world a very much worse place for everyone who's still here. But I think it's quite the opposite. When we look face to face at our end, we can love, we can laugh, we can dance, and we can sing. When I look into the future and see doom, I ask, how do I want to live when I know that I stare down oblivion? Does it change that much from what I would do knowing that I myself will someday die? Not really. I want to love and cherish the people who mean so much to me, and I want to contribute to the communities that I do care about, even if they are communities that don't exist yet, if they're ones that will only come after me. I ask myself what kind of ancestor I want to be, even if I don't know whose ancestor I'm talking about yet. An ancestor doesn't merely mean genetically. It means culturally, means as a species, as an inhabitant of the earth. Which is why I do things that I see as valuable online, whether that's making a YouTube video or updating my site. So far from feeling paralyzed and afraid to live life the way I want to, I feel all the more energized to live life in a way that's uncompromising and unapologetic, but also loving and open to the world around me. And one question that comes up is whether or not to have children. Lots of us these days have that question. Can it be responsible to have children in a world that seems so sure to be overcrowded and congested with carbon? I'll say that I do support population control via something like reproduction licenses. And this sounds scary and authoritarian at first, but I don't really see a way outside of overpopulation outside of it. I don't see a way that we can get outside of a kind of free rider problem where everyone knows that the Earth is too populated, but everyone on an individual level, or a lot of people on an individual level, want to have kids. And I do think it's true that in a lot of extremely advanced industrial societies, we do go the opposite way. There is a underpopulation problem in a lot of our most advanced societies, like Japan and South Korea, increasingly Western places, and I don't think that that will be enough to solve a problem of overpopulation, because as the other parts of the world become overpopulated, like sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, these places are still experiencing positive population growth, and with industrialization, they'll eventually level out and start experiencing declining birth rates like the rest of the world, probably. But the overshoot that's going to cause in the short term will reach an unsustainable level, I think. And that's why I think the only way out of that, or the most peaceful way out of that, is something like requiring a license to reproduce. Now, obviously, people are going to break the law to do it, but it's a pretty valuable, it's a pretty big impediment towards that. And, I think we already have restrictions on who can raise adopted children, so what's wrong about doing it for biological children? Of course, people will distrust whoever's implementing it, and I agree. Certainly, I don't think most of our current governments I would trust with implementing something like reproduction licenses, but that's just that's an argument against having any laws. All kinds of potential laws and global frameworks can be abused if there's bad people in power. But anyway, pushing that situation aside, I do say that at least right now, I'm single, and I'm 32. When you get around this age, you think biology kicks in, and you start feeling kind of an urge and need to reproduce. And I don't know if I will. I'm single, but I do feel at this moment like I would like to have children. If there's any cute girls in the Arctic or Japan who want a husband, hit me up. But can I necessarily argue that this is the most objectively responsible thing to do? No, I can't. But I do try to look at the people who are most in touch with nature and who live the most quote-unquote sustainable lives. Small tribes in the Amazon, the Arctic, and other areas on the periphery. And most of them have children. Lots of them, in fact. Nor are they ignorant of how the climate is changing. They're usually, in fact, the most aware of it, and the most immediately affected. And yet they refuse to sacrifice on the most essential thing to safeguard in nature, the possibility of reproduction and regeneration. And I might want to wait until I live a more quote-unquote sustainable life to do that. But at some level, I do think that, yes, we have to surrender to our biology here and live according to the directives of nature, which encourages us to continue. Does it seem like a hopeless, bleak future we look out towards? Yes. Do we feel ambivalence and fear about bringing children into a world headed on our course? Yes. But people have been feeling this way for a couple thousand years now. And yet we've continued to reproduce, and I at least can say that I'm glad we've done so, in spite of it all. So I do say look towards the future, and be a pillar supporting the world that's falling down around you. And remember that in times like these, there have always been times like these. Anyway, little fireside chat for today. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.